Okay, hi everyone. This is I'm going to just run through the lecture from Wednesday. I did I did record it during the session, but unfortunately the sound quality wasn't quite good enough and didn't capture everything because I was recording from the front of the class. So I thought I'd just run through the PowerPoint now instead, and let you know the steps that we followed in the seminar afterwards. Um, So the topic for this week was action and participatory research, and I've expanded the title here to include activist research and reflective research, which are kind of aligned within participatory and action research, but are slightly have differences. So I'm going to talk about those a bit here. As I say, most of the readings this week focused on um, more traditional forms of action research, um, and the videos told us about participatory action research. Um, so I'm just going to expand upon that here. I thought that the second video on participatory action research with Dr. Jason Campbell was particularly good in explaining the difference between typical uh, research where a researcher has participants external to themselves, and participant research where the researcher is an active participant themselves. And I thought he did a good job of explaining the difference in that, particularly in terms of the kind of data we generate, um, which is that normally you would approach research with a kind of phenomenological um, framework, wherein the the participants are insiders to a situation, and the researcher, through questioning them and getting answers in return, generates data that will help them to understand that situation. Whereas in participatory research, the researcher is an active participant in that setting, um, and therefore is a co-producer of data, and their own experience within that setting constitutes data as well. But as I said, he explains it very well, much better than I did just then. So, and he has a diagram with two stick men to illustrate that relationship. So I'd suggest going back to that if you're unclear. um, this cycle here actually comes from Kolb, and it's Kolb's idea of a learning cycle. He first well, 1978 that he first formulated this cycle, which has gone through various iterations since, and now has become has also been turned into a quadrant model with kind of two axes running through the center like a crosshair of the cycle, and that's the one people are most familiar with, perhaps, which is the learning styles module. But it started with this learning cycle, and the idea that is that in the way we learn is that we progress from concrete experience, and then we reflect upon that experience, and he calls this reflective observation, which is where we think about our experience, and we formulate ideas about it, and this leads to abstract conceptualization, whereby we create concepts through which we can better understand that experience. I suppose this is similar to building theory, I suppose, and then this in turn is followed by active experimentation, which is where we, on the basis of those concepts that we've established, and that reflection that we've undertaken, we experiment and we change things, which leads to different concrete experience, and then the cycle reiterates itself. So it's an iterative process by which we increase our learning as we work around the cycle. So the model suggests, and action research is similarly cyclical, in that it involves us having an experience, reflecting upon it, or gathering data about it, forming ideas about it, or concepts or theories, and then we actively experiment, where during that stage where we change something and then do it again. And it's through this iterative process um, making changes, seeing what happens, doing it uh, again and again, that leads us to actually to change something and to gain a better understanding of it. Um, and so it's important to see the active experimentation and the idea of change as being a crucial aspect of action research and an output or an outcome unto itself. So whereas normally within a research project you would have the output would be the research paper or the research report or working towards understanding or gain or knowledge generation. Action research actually seeks to effect change in a more tangible or utilitarian way. So actually changes the situation, which is why it's I think has a natural affinity with education and other kind of institutional settings where we're trying to achieve best practice through reflecting on what happens and making changes. And I think it's that happens inevitably within education and other settings without us necessarily putting the label of research onto it. It's just a process of progressing and improving things. But when we align that with a research agenda and the idea that we're doing this to generate something that we can then share and disseminate, we would call that action research. And Gibbs and another thing to point out about that though is that the idea of reflection, which Kolb identifies in his cycle with reflective observation, is key to action research, and particularly in educational settings where quite commonly action research will involve teachers developing their own practice. So they might be working on their pedagogical approaches or something, and it's through reflection that they will work out what they're going to change. Not reflection alone; they'll typically gather data as well from other stakeholders and participants in a setting. But certainly, reflection is a key aspect of that. And this is why I extended the title this week to include reflective research, because reflective practice is another. It's a concept unto itself, really, reflective practice. But essentially, it's about it's similar to action research in that it involves an iterative approach of reflection and change. And Gibbs, who is one of the earlier people to have conceptualized reflective practice, drew upon Kolb in formulating the process a model for reflective practice, and according to Gibbs's model, the reflection should begin with description of what has happened. So this is aligning this with Kolb, I suppose, the idea of concrete experience. Your first task is to explain that experience, or rather to describe it. So what happened? What is there to reflect upon? So identifying what it is that you're seeking to reflect on. And at this stage, it's not about making judgments or drawing conclusions necessarily. It's just about getting a descriptive account of what's happened. And this, though, is followed by the more reflective aspects of it, one of which is identifying what your feelings were. And this is an important aspect, I think, of any setting where you are a participant in it yourself, or any research project where you as a researcher are a participant, is that feelings become very important. And this doesn't necessarily have to have those kind of cuddly connotations when we talk about our feelings as such. It could just simply mean, how did we feel at that instance? Did it provoke anxiety in us? Did we feel it was going positively or negatively? These kind of things. But emotional responses are often crucial to our reflection on situations. And this would be followed by evaluation. And this is at the point that we do make value judgments. What was good or bad about that experience? This is to the point at which we make a judgment, and which will lead us to a decision about what we might change further down the line. And then we come to analysis. So this, I suppose, is where we're at the abstract conceptualization stage of Kolb's cycle. I mean, these cycles don't map entirely onto each other, but I know that Gibbs certainly drew upon Kolb, so this is, I suppose, where we move through that stage. The question is, what sense can we make of this situation? And this is where we might bring in ideas from outside the experience to enhance our reflections or to enhance our analysis. This might be, for example, through literature review, or bringing a theoretical framework to bear on our reflections. And this is often similar to what we might call analytical triangulation or theoretical triangulation, which is where we're bringing theoretical insight to bear on primary research insight, which in this case is our own reflective insight, reflective practice. And finally, this leads us to conclusions. And building upon those conclusions is our action plan. So this is, what are we going to do differently next time? What steps are you going to take on the basis of what you've learned? So this is the idea that we learn about something, we make value judgments, and then we seek to change it next time to make things better. And that's essentially a reflective practice cycle as outlined by Gibbs, which is has a natural affinity with action research, and indeed is often used as a basis for practitioner research in education. Sorry, this slide's a bit blurry, but if you work clockwise from the top on this slide, you will see that one point. This is an action research cycle, and one of the key aspects about this is that this kind of cycle, which differs from a purely self-reflective cycle, is that we gather data. So the third point round on the cycle here, data is evaluated to assess the approach taken. This may involve looking at the views of multiple stakeholders and can include a variety of methods. So, for instance, in an educational setting, if we were looking at our implementing a particular pedagogical technique in a classroom setting, in a disciplinary setting, and seeing whether it worked whether it was appropriate to the curriculum or something, this might involve gathering student feedback or observer feedback or peer feedback alongside our own reflections about the undertaking, and those together would constitute our data set that we can then use to make change in due course. So that's I suppose a whistle-stop account of reflective practice and action research. But as I say, the stuff on the Moodle this week, the videos and the readings go into this in much greater detail, and also it's important to note that this is action research is a broad church, and there are many approaches to it. So this by no means is exhaustive, and reading across that you'll see different approaches to it. Sometimes this kind of diagrammatic cyclical model is dispensed with, and people take a much more fluid narrative approach to action research as well. But ultimately the steps are the same, and they always involve reflection, evaluation, conceptualization, and change. This is a shame. Well, you can see two of them here. There were actually 4 diagrams here, and I think in running this on my Mac, for some reason, 2 of the diagrams you can't see, but they are screen grabs of journal titles. The ones missing are Educational Action Research and Journal of Teacher Education, I think. But these are all journals that publish a lot of accounts of teachers' reflective practice or action research, iterative research projects. So if anybody wants to look into this further, there's now a kind of dedicated journal infrastructure for that kind of research. And indeed, there are some some volumes by publishers like Sage and Routledge about these methods as well. So the other type of research that I wanted to include this week was activist research. So the to distinguish from action research, activist research, I suppose, and this is a generalisation, but typically it would have it seeks to affect change in the same way as action research, but this is typically on a grander, more it's more politicised perhaps, and or ideologically engaged. And so the first bullet point I put here is that it's interested as opposed to disinterested, and this is to contrast it with, I suppose, the norm of social science research or the norm of academic research generally outside the humanities, is where we have this idea that the researcher should be disinterested and detached, and that in doing so they safeguard against bias and so on and so forth, and that they can pursue knowledge in as neutral and disinterested a way as possible. Activist research makes no such claim to disinterested positions. On the contrary, it is explicitly interested. It declares at the outset a desire to. It makes value judgments at the beginning, and proceeds from a position which states that something is wrong and needs to be changed, or something needs to be pursued, or something like that. Often this is a social justice agenda, so it will be concerned with with ameliorating the situation of marginalised groups or disenfranchised people, doing away with oppressive structures or things like that, always as deemed by the researcher. And for this reason, it's often aligned with critical pedagogy, which you may or may not be familiar with, but this is a strand of educational writing and theory that key figures being Paulo Freire and Henry Giroux, and it's using education to pursue and effect social change, and particularly with an idea that traditional educational models are oppressive and perpetuate inequalities and an oppressive status quo. And so different teaching models are used to try and circumvent those structures. So in Freire's case, it was the idea of education working groups, where people work together to emancipate themselves from their situation through knowledge. So it was reading groups, workers' education, adult education, that kind of thing. Sorry, bear with me a second. Sorry, I just had to close the door on my dog there. The Freire, it's polemic work, often critical pedagogy. It makes no secret of its ideological position, and that runs through activist research often. For this reason, that the legitimacy of activist research is fiercely debated. People sometimes feel that the fact that it is interested and that the researcher has a vested interest or a declared interest in something undermines its claims to scholarship, and therefore makes the legitimacy and the validity of the findings debatable. As I'll come to on the next slide, that there are counter arguments to that. But another thing to say about activist research is it's often born with frustration, born of frustration with detached norms in research. And I found this quote from a guy called Kevin Dunn, who is a international relations scholar, and he wrote an excellent account of his own personal position in relation to the field of international relations, which in his view had become too dispassionate and was a classic ivory tower phenomenon where scholars shared their understanding of situations in very esoteric terms, but it had no impact on the people they should be working to help. And he contrasts this with his earlier life as a teenager, as a politically active teenager who was very heavily involved in activism for to do with labour struggles and improving the lot of subaltern groups in America. And his quote here is that academia has alienated me from the world that I'm trying to understand by decrying emotions and passion. So he feels there that he's far from helping us to improve the world. Academia can sometimes stand in the way of that, and so activist research seeks to get past that. And Hale outlines two central propositions, he calls them, within activist research that address some of those concerns highlighted in the previous slide. Firstly, that he suggests that there is no necessary contradiction between active political commitment to resolving a problem and rigorous scholarly research on that problem. So you can still undertake scholarship when you are politically committed to something. And the second proposition is that activist research has the potential to lead to better research outcomes, deeper and more thorough empirical knowledge of the problem at hand, as well as theoretical understanding that otherwise would be difficult to achieve. So that by being an insider and having that personal experience, we actually have a more thorough knowledge and our empirical position is enhanced. And a third ancillary problem is that research outcome is improved when these tensions are identified and confronted directly. This is, I think, to me, actually, is the most important one, particularly in the context of what we've been looking at on this module as a whole. If you remember in the first week, we were talking about bias and confirmation bias and subjectivity, and the need in social science research, and particularly in qualitative research, to acknowledge our own positionality and our own subjectivity, which far from invalidating research actually helps to enhance validity in this context, because we are explicitly acknowledging aspects of our position that might lead to that might colour our analyses or drive our research in a particular way. And it's by acknowledging that and being explicit about that that we give our readers a more honest and open statement of our research that they can factor into their own analyses. So I think that's an important point to make generally, but particularly germane to activist research. I'm going to skip through these slides pretty quickly, but I put them here really just to give an example of some research that's being undertaken or has been undertaken at Kent, which has very explicitly change-oriented or action research outcomes. It's the Imagining Autism project, which is a collaboration between the drama department, the School of Arts, and the psychology department at the university, and it explicitly seeks to remediate the difficulties autistic children have with communication, social interaction, and imagination. So far from just seeking to understand or to enrich understanding of all these other kind of verbs that we use to explain research that is where the outcome is knowledge or understanding. It has the outcomes. The verb here is to remediate, so to actually try and effect a change. And let's see it again here. Interventions with the children have been recorded and evaluated, which will be developed into a transferable, proven methodology for activities that affect positive change in the behaviour of autistic children. So they actually want to do something that is transferable. They want to give some to establish a robust methodology that they can share that will therefore help to affect positive change in other settings as well. So the website for that is Imagining Autism. As I say, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but you can go and look at that. But really, the point I wanted to make here was that it's an excellent example of research that has a change-based aim. So that's all that we covered in the lecture part of the of Wednesday's session. The references are here. This second one down is a different Gibbs to the one above, but it's a lit review on the use of action research in higher education, which is in Educational Action Research. This is a very recent literature review, so that would be very useful for anybody who was thinking of doing this kind of research. There'd be a lot of sources in that. So that's going to be a key resource for anyone wanting to do that. In the second part of the session on Wednesday, well, we worked through these first 3 questions here as a group to work out what the challenges associated with participatory research are, and what some of the epistemological and ethical implications are. So we had a long discussion about that, and a lot emerged from that, particularly the challenge of maintaining a dual role and all the implications of that, particularly if you're undertaking it with colleagues, and how do you negotiate those 2 roles. And in the second half of the session, we worked on the 4th bullet point here, where we tried to devise possible participatory action or activist or reflective research projects, and that was also very, very useful. And at this was a stage where I think people's thinking about what they might want to do for their assignment started coming out. So we segued from designing participatory research projects to looking more generally at what people's ideas are at the moment, of what kind of research they want to undertake, what kind of methods they want to use, and so on. And this will feed directly into next week's session. So if you look on the Moodle for next week, there is it's planning your research project is the title of the session. But if you look down there, one of the things that I've included on there is a research proposal canvas, and this is really just designed to help you map out any ideas and use it as you will. There's no expectation that people come with a finely honed and thorough research proposal at this stage. It could just be some bullet points scrawled in each of the boxes. But this will just be a way that next week we can all talk about our emerging ideas and critique each other's ideas and so on. So that was that, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.